to wait another minute for more people to join. Thanks so much.
That's where I projected up there.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning. My name is Ruth Cologne Wagner, and I'm Director of Training and Development for NIAPRS, the New York Association of Psychiatric Rehabilitation Services. I thank you all so much for joining us today. I gotta tell you, really honored to have CCSI, the Coordinated Care Services Incorporated, with us today to present to us, in particular, Lenora Reed-Rose and Nancy Sung Shelton, and I'll introduce them in a moment. If you could go to the next slide, please. I want to begin, as I usually begin, with a shout out to our wonderful partners on the Care Management Training Initiative project. I think we have some technical, there you go, thanks so much. Okay, so our wonderful partners on this project, the New York State Council for Community Behavioral Health Care, New York Care Coordination Program, of which we have with us today, the Center for Practice Innovations, the Coalition of Behavioral Health, and the National Council. All right, so I wanted just to take a moment and say that, as you know, the training ends with our October regional office hours. And it seems like a while now, but we've had so many great webinars and videos. We began in January, and by October, we're actually going to have a total of 14 webinars and videos. So as this training is contract funded, we report out our outcomes, just like many of you in our audience, our trainees. And so I wanted just to bring that up and let you know that if you haven't already received emails, you will be receiving emails from our partner, Cindy Levinoy of the New York State Council for Community Behavioral Health Care. And she is emailing everyone who has one or more items or activities to watch. And we ask that you please do this, and not just because of our funding requirements, but because the content is so great. And so we hope that you can do that. As you missed the training, which is what we're talking about, anything that you've missed, please go to our website. And that is wrong. It says CMIT. Please know that it's cmti.niaprs.org. And just a reminder, you do get 10 continuing education hours for social work, CRCC, and CPRP. Can we go to the next slide, please? Wonderful, thank you. So this is the CCSI team, and I'd like to first introduce Lenora Reed-Rose. She's the Director of Cultural Competence and Health Literacy Department at CCSI, and she served as a consultant and educator at the state level, regional level, and national level. She's got extensive experience in developing, implementing cultural competence assessments, training initiatives, and programs, and she helps organizations to understand where they are on the continuum of cultural competence, and then, in her technical assistance, identifies critical changes that can happen in policy, practice, and education and training to help support the process. And then we have with us today Nancy Sung Shelton, and she's the Senior Consultant in the Cultural Competence and Health Literacy Department at CCSI, and she works with Lenora. Her work experience includes working in the criminal justice system, family law, child protection and advocacy, human services, developmental disabilities, behavioral and physical health care system. So obviously she's got a wealth of experience that she brings along with her. She's a community advocate and she serves on many boards and committees throughout the greater Rochester area. She's especially devoted to working with people who have been marginalized by society and have been underserved, underrepresented, and economically disadvantaged. And this is, you see Ensley there. He unfortunately is not joining us today, but he is part of the team over at CCSI. So with that, Lenora and Nancy, I hand it over to you. Thank you so much for joining us today. Lenora, Nancy? Please give us a moment while we figure out what the problem is on our end. Thank you. Nancy, if you can hear me, you can please begin.
We should begin now?
Yes, please begin. Lenora, Nancy, please begin.
Okay, thank you, Ruth. And I'm hoping that folks will be hearing us because we were having some difficulties here that we really did not hear Ruth in her few slides that she presented. So we're excited to be with you today. And today we are going to be exploring with you the interconnectedness of cultural competence and person-centeredness. We will talk about how personal and implicit biases and culture can impact the way in which we engage with each other and with service recipients. We will spend some time on the individual's, family's cultural nuances as it relates to engagement and touch a little bit on some customs and traditions that folks have, folks that you may be engaging with. We will also engage you in cross-cultural communications of the nuances and some things that we need to pay attention to. We'll have some polling at the end and then a summary. We would like for you, and Ruth may have mentioned this, but we would like for you to use the chat box, and don't ask me where, this is somewhere there, where you can send us questions while we are speaking and we will address them. We don't necessarily want to wait, or we don't need to wait until the end of the presentation. There's something that you really need clarification on while we are doing this, then we will address it accordingly. Our first slide, we're going to be thinking about what is culture? How do we define culture? First, I want to say culture is something that we all have. It doesn't matter what your race or your ethnicity is, we all have culture. And as defined here, is a way of life of a group of people that encompasses attitudes, behaviors, beliefs, values, symbols, and the list goes on and on. There are different kinds of culture experiences. It could be experiential or it could be inherent. If you think of work affiliations or volunteer affiliations, there is a culture that surrounds that. There is a culture if you consider yourself a peer, you consider yourself, I used to do accounting, so when I think of the accountant, there is a culture that goes around that. For those identify themselves as LGBTQ, there is a culture. Working women, residential experiences, those are, we define those more on the experiential side. Inherent, you think of country of affiliation. You think of languages, you think of religion or spirituality, and race and ethnic groups. If we think of languages, I love languages because very often we think of language as Spanish to English, or it could be, let's see, French to English, or vice versa. But language, if you think broader in terms of language, we usually speak about in the work that we do, what's the common language? So very often we think of we're speaking to someone who speaks the same language like we do. There's some colloquialism that very often, if you miss it, then you will not be communicating with that person effectively. So the theme to take away, culture is broadly defined. I used to define for myself, it is the blood that runs through my vein. And if you think of what that means, it's everything about you. It really dictates how we do things, what we do, when we do it. It's everything about us. And the message from that side is that culture. It's not just brown and black people. We all, European Americans, we also have a culture. You know, we don't have time to go into all of that in this presentation, but know that we all have one. And it impacts the way we work, it impacts what we do, it impacts how we engage. And cultural identity is the feeling of belonging to a particular group. So we speak of a black professional woman, gay person living in the suburbs who works in advertising, a conservative religious Muslim. Those are some of the examples that we wanted to share with you. And if you look on our little purple bubble, there's several identified there: marital status, job status, gender, income. As you talk about the folks who shop at Wegmans, for those who live in this area, or the folks who shop at Walmart, the folks who shop at Price Right, the folks who shop at the corner store. There is literally a difference in how we engage, how we go about our own grocery shopping compared to how others do it. Level of education. And this is very important because one of the things that we wanted to take away from these slides is what do you do with this information when you are engaging with your colleagues or engaging with those that you serve? And if we look on this slide, we normally say one of the things that you can do with the information on this slide in the bubble is to use them as your data points or your data elements. So when you're beginning to look on disparities in care, you can literally say, okay, so folks who are below a 4th grade level, we're not doing so well with them. What do we do? This can really help to drive the way you engage and the outcomes that you get based on the engagement that you have. Person-centeredness. I know very often we can get caught up is it person-centered care? Is it cultural competence care? What is it? What we're going to be sharing with you today, it is both. And our next slides will show the overlap. But what is person-centeredness? A person-centered approach, from our perspective, it focuses on the individual's personal needs, their wants, and their desires. This can mean putting the person's needs as they define them. And I know us very often, we want to define what people's needs are out of the goodness of our heart. We're so eager to help that we want to say, here comes Lenore for service. She's a black woman. She said she's so this is her need. And we wanted to get out of that to begin to say, what is the person defining as their need, truly defining as their need, and to accept it as their truth. Within, and that brings in, when we think of cultural competence, so we're going to go through the next few slides. We're going to talk a little about person-centered approach. We're going to talk a little about cultural competence, and we're going to show you the overlap. I just want you to stay with us for a little bit till we get there. So it's the ability to offer providers to bridge cultural differences and to build effective relationship so that the individual with whom you're engaging can have positive outcomes. great outcomes, we speak of equitable outcomes. And there's several, if you go to the internet or you go to the literature, there's several definitions on cultural competence that you can engage with and you can use. Very often I ask folks to, in terms of defining cultural competence, in its broadest sense, is to look on attitudes, values, beliefs, and behaviors. These are some key pieces that we would like you to pay attention to when you're thinking of providing care that's culturally relevant and appropriate. So it's the attitudes, the values, the beliefs, and behaviors that really come together from individuals working within the system so that care can be delivered in a way that's responsive to clients and also responsive to those who you engage with in your organization. And if you focus on these a little bit, they're very hard things to change. It's very hard to change someone's attitude. How do you accept someone's values and someone's belief that is very, very different from your own? And how do you bridge the gap between both so those who you're serving can really get outcomes that meet who they are as individuals? When we think of the intersection or the overlap between person-centeredness and cultural competence, this is a great slide. And I'm sure you guys have been out there doing this kind of work that you can add to either circle and probably in the overlap. So if you see this as the beginning, because sometimes very often what I find in the work that we do and when we're training or engaging, that folks we are training usually have a good sense of what it is, and what we do is kind of bring it to the forefront so more attention can be focused on it. If we look at the overlap for those two circles, understands and is interested in the patient as a unique person, explores and respects the beliefs, values, meaning of the illness, maintains and is able to convey unconditional positive regards. That's a great overlap. If you look on either side, person-centered approaches and cultural competence that does not fit in, then you see where there are some differences. And differences not to be thrown out, but differences to be integrated into delivering services and engage with your colleagues. And we will focus on both because we want you to pay attention, not just with the patients that you're engaging with, to pay attention as well to those who you work with on a day-to-day basis. Because individuals, like we said, we all have culture and we all have those nuances that impacts how we work and how we engage. So if we think of person-centered approach, person-centeredness focusing on the person as a patient. So it's looking on the person as a service recipient. Who is it that's coming to you for services? Focusing on the person. Whereas cultural competence focuses on the patient as a person. Very subtle differences, but the differences are there. And if we're thinking of disparities in care and outcome, we need to have a better understanding of what those differerences are, as slight as they are. And in terms of looking at disparities, which of our patients are getting great outcomes and which ones aren't? Which patients are we engaging with and which ones aren't? Because that's how the data that we collect will help us to begin to tease out and help to define for us what else we need to do so that all the patients that we serve or all the recipient of services will get services, or we will be able to modify and adapt what we do so that each one can really get services that meet their needs. And then if you flip that for internal with your colleagues, so your colleagues can have really a satisfying job experience, because very often what the data says, if that experience is not satisfying, then what the outcomes of their work will not be as great. Now we're going to have Nancy is going to focus on implicit bias.
Good morning, everyone. Pleasure to speak with you all. Thank you, Lenore, for setting the tone and providing us with a common language as we continue to have this conversation. So we'll talk about personal bias and culture. And basically, when we talk about it, we have to establish first and foremost, who am I? That's a rather profound question to ask. And I think it's a lifelong journey to determine who you are, because as we experience different things through our lifelong journey, we start to clearly define and build that notion of who am I. How is that shaped? It's shaped by our childhood experiences. And these are things that we often take for granted because they just occur. There are our cultural identity search that begins to happen when we grow older and we start to understand who we are and how we fit into the world. And then we have the cultural identity achievement, where we accept who we are and how we impact the world as we interact with it. We take that notion of who we are and we apply it into the conversation regarding personal and implicit bias. What is that? It's the judgment and or behavior that operates at a level below our conscious awareness and without our intentional control. A lot of times we need to understand that implicit bias absolutely serves a purpose. Bias often can have a negative connotation associated with it because it can look like stereotypes, prejudice, discrimination, and stigma, resulting in disparities. But on a very lower level, it provides us with protective features as part of our survival modes. So it tells us that certain things may be dangerous. So we build our implicit bias based on our personal experiences, the environment in which we live in, and our biology. And again, it relies on our instinct, and it makes us make snapshots around our surroundings and people we meet so that we can be safe in whatever situation that we feel that we may be in danger. The thing about personal implicit bias, like I mentioned, it can look like stereotypes, prejudice, discrimination, and stigma, and we have to manage that. Another important critical feature of implicit bias is the fact that once it's there, it never goes away. And that can sound initially disheartening. However, we do have the capacity to manage it. So how do we manage it? We must first become aware that it exists. It's there. And why is it there? That's when we move into the next step, when we use the power of logic to understand why we're feeling that way. Why do we have this bias? Is it logically connected to anything? Is it just a feeling that we have that have negative associations, but it has no reason or rhyme or reason or purpose? It's just there. When we experience that moment where it doesn't make sense why we have that particular bias, we must hit the pause button. We call it the powerful pause. We take a breath to think and rationalize why we're feeling the way that we're feeling. This gives you a chance to kind of override that unconscious mind and then be able to let that rational thought to come in. For example, if you're walking on the street and you see a young black man coming towards you in your direction, you grab your purse a little tighter, or you decide to cross the street. You have to have that power of logic to determine, why did I feel threatened by this person? Is it rational for me to feel that way? And then process, what do I do next? So managing your personal or implicit bias can create some common ground, because once we understand it, we can begin to value the differences and diversity of other people. And then we can also take the opportunity to focus on what we have in common with those individuals. And you have to remind yourself of the need to be fair at key times. You either this happens internally, you can have reminders around you to kind of help you and aid you in the process to manage your implicit bias and just make you more consciously aware. It also serves as a key reminder for people who may necessarily even be in your space that they have some implicit biases that may require some attention. You may also need to know where you are in terms of your motivation to change or manage your bias. You may have to have a really stern internal dialogue with yourself to say that, you know, I know that I felt this way my entire life. It doesn't make sense. And what do I need to do to change that thought? One of the things we certainly say about implicit bias, as I mentioned, once it's there, it stays there forever. And all we can do is manage that process of evaluating our surroundings. So we say that when you encounter a moment when you recognize that you're experiencing an implicit bias, you follow that first thought. And the real work happens in the second thought and your first action. Worldviews reinforce those biases. And so what are worldviews? They are shared values and assumptions on which customs, norms, and institutions are based. Worldviews help to determine our values. So the way that I look at it is that worldviews is like the mother, and our biases is the child of worldviews. What happens when we don't recognize and acknowledge our worldviews? When we do acknowledge it, it promotes our mutual understanding of others, and we begin to embrace our values and our uniqueness and our sameness with other people in our spaces. It helps to build cross-cultural understanding and to resolve conflicts. We can be able to work collaboratively together. We can create new rituals and new traditions. We can find inclusive environments in which we can build together. When we don't acknowledge and recognize our worldviews, we may impose our worldviews on others. Best example is the golden rule, where we say, do unto others as we would have them do unto us. And really there's a faulty notion in that saying, because when we acknowledge the difference of others and we acknowledge that other people function differently, the golden rule really should be do unto others as they would have it done to them. So we don't impose our own selves on others. And also when we don't acknowledge and recognize our worldviews, we can create conflict through that imposition. How biases can impact your service delivery? Because every situation that we enter into, and whether we are a neighbor, a loved one, or a service provider, we bring ourselves to it. So all our thoughts, our values, our beliefs, our morals interact with how we provide our services. So here, as it states, biases can contribute to disparities and to dig deeper, because such effects may often be unintentional and not obvious from standard assessments. The thing about intention is that a lot of times we forgive ourselves for missteps or cultural faux pas because we didn't mean to do it. We have to really live in the realm of the impact of our choices, our behaviors, our decisions, because of the conversation, people really focus on what happened, not what you thought about or what you meant to happen. So another way that bias impacts service delivery, that we need to develop a greater degree of self-awareness. It's really work that you have to do within yourself when we are in the presence of bias, and we recognize it within ourselves, to understand how it may affect the quality of care we provide to our patients and actively seek ways of identifying and overcoming it. So again, focus on that second thought and that first action. I'm going to pass this over to Ms. Lenora. She's going to continue to talk about cultural nuances and engagement.
And thank you, Nancy. And Nancy just shared with you about worldviews and biases, and that becomes very, very important when you begin, or when we begin to engage with individuals we serve and those with whom we work. This is a very simple tool that we decided to share with you guys. I'm sure you're probably doing some of the things that we suggest in this tool. It speaks to listen, be open, and be respectful. And in listening, where you want to ask questions like, what is your understanding of what happened to you? And some of these, it's, you know, Arthur Kleinman, gosh, it's probably the 90s or something, created this exploratory model. And so much work has been done using Arthur Kleinman's model as the framework. And this tool uses the essence of that model as well. So what is your understanding of what happened? What is worrying you the most? What does your family think about it? So I want you to take note of that and the family into it. Because very often the family's thoughts are, it does impact us as folks receiving care or even folks coming to work. It's very important to engage family, engage a community into some of our thinking. We need to be very, when you get responses from individuals, because sometimes we get responses and we say to ourselves, oh no, that can't be. So we slip in our own answers. So who do you normally turn to for support? That's huge. Who do I go to for support? May not be anyone in your lexicon or anyone that you think about. So let's be very open to, it could be Mookie, you know, Nancy and I, we have what we call like Mookie around the corner. Mookie around the corner. Mookie around the corner. and thank you guys. And we need to just be very open to whatever it is that when we ask the questions and we get the answers, we literally need to say, okay, if this is who you go to for support, then we can ask clarifying questions. Be respectful. Who makes the decision about your care? That's very, very, very important when it comes to beginning to someone's culture, because in cultural groups, different individuals make the decisions regarding somebody's care. It doesn't very often, sometimes, it is not the person who is sitting before you. So if I'll say to you, who makes the decision? If I say my minister makes the decision, which very often our religious folks impact, or spiritual folks, does have a great impact on how decisions are made about one's health, especially one's behavioral health, then it means that you need to bring that person in to have a conversation with them. So be very respectful to the answers that you receive. And is there anyone else you would like me to talk about? It's a question that I see very often into assessment forms, so you guys may already be doing this. But my only addition to that is, if the person says that this is who to talk to, then you need to be respectful to that person, because very often it is that person who really can help to make this person move, change their behaviors, change their patterns of seeking care. So knowing the community you serve, I know sometimes when we see a person before us that we are engaging with them and trying to help them or navigate the system, we probably don't think of the community at large. But let's remember that folks come from communities and they go back to the communities. So one of the first things that I would suggest that you need to do is to define the community. How does this individual with whom you're working, how do they define their community? Who is this community? Is it huge? Is it a smaller thing? And outside of that, if we're thinking of the city or the county, wherever you live, where people live does impact their outcomes. So we need to think about where they work, live, and play. It has a great impact on how they access services, what do they do with it, and what they do when they go back to their own communities. Important is the demographic trends, what is happening, what are the norms of that community, and what are some of the specific interests and needs of the community. One way in which we suggest that you find out is to begin to assess the community profile. And very often you can get a lot of that data from the census, from schools, from United Way. You know, the police force has a great data source that can help us with assessing the community, the profile of the community. Next slide, please. Okay, we'll just go on. Since it's not, the next slide is not coming up. It's there. All right, so one of the things that we also, that's not the next slide, a huge focus, as we talk about profiling the community. So what are some of the cultural attributes of that community? And if you look on the identity, we tend to focus on race, ethnicity, age, gender, sexual orientation, marital status, and family role. What's the role of the family in a person's life? Language and literacy, you're thinking of not just the language spoken within the community, but you also want to talk about an individual's literacy level, their reading levels. So very often someone speaks, we speak the same language. We would love you to begin also to focus on, if we're saying, for example, that the caregiver and the recipient of care speak English, what are their reading levels? It could be at a grade 2, a grade 3, a grade 4. Very rarely, I mean, people tend to think of it as at a grade 8. That's an extremely, extremely high level. So we want you to focus on what is the reading level, because if people can't read what you tell them or they can't understand what you're saying, very often when they leave you, then they will not be following through with whatever suggestions that you give. Some other things, the origin, where people are from, because that's going to be very important in terms of assimilation and acculturation. You know, we found out somebody who we employed a few years ago. The person came from New York City, and the job that the person had to do, and we live in Rochester, upstate, and the job that the person had to do, we're asking them, they're taking a lot of traveling. What we did not know in upstate Monroe County, where we are, the assumption is that if you consider yourself a professional, you'd have your driver's license, and you'd definitely, there'd be no way that you would not have a car. Well, guess what? Now I'm speaking too loud. Oh, Christ. Now, you know, so I'm sorry. So we have.
Your entry is not valid.
So what happened is for the individual, we noticed that they were putting like taxi fares. I said, oh my gosh, why is this person, you know, asking for reimbursement for taxi fares? Well, this person did not have a car, because in New York City, I feel you can get around on the subway and on the bus, or there are many different forms of transportation that exist that does not exist in Rochester. So we did not find out, and we learned our lesson, and since then we act accordingly. But it really is important to find out where someone is coming from, what are the nuances, what are they used to, and then what do you need to take into consideration when you engage. And the social determinants of health, it's huge. It's huge. Very often the data says, and it's really true, that someone does not get well in the doctor's office, or sometimes with the engagement with us. That only equates to 30%, 30 the most, of them recovering. Very often, most of the care happens when they go back to where they work, live, and play. So we have to take the social determinants of health into consideration when we are engaging with individuals. And we have some suggestions there. I'm going to go back to education levels. Education level is huge. What we have found in the literature and in our conversations with others, the lower the educational level of an individual, the worse are their health outcomes. So if we know that, then you can modify how you engage to ensure that an individual has great health outcomes. Engagement with relationship is huge when we think of engagement and collaboration. And we have a piece here, conscious of the time, and I want you guys time to ask questions. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but gaining awareness, preparing for action, taking action, and staying alive. Being prepared when you're going to be meeting or engaging with an individual is extremely important. You need to understand the individual, who they are as a cultural being. You have to decide, and that's important. You know, I know you guys collect data on an individual, and I'm sure some of the things you collect already are things on who they are as cultural beings. You'll do age, gender, race, ethnicity. Be prepared. What is it? What do you know about these individuals? What can you learn prior to? And as much as it seems like it's stereotypical, it really doesn't have to be. What it does, any information prior to meeting an individual, I'm going to suggest you use it as an hypothesis and not as a fact, as a place you can launch your conversation and a place in which you can begin to tease out and understand who that person is before you begin to take action or make decisions as to this is who you're seeing. So it's okay to say Lenora is a Jamaican, and Lenora is a Jamaican, and this is how she should behave. Should we pause?
We're just pausing for a moment because we know there's some problems with the audio.
So,
We're having some technical difficulties. Please give us a moment. This is Ruth. I apologize for these difficulties. We need another minute, please. Sorry about this.
we're here, Ruth. Hi, Ruth, we're here.
Thank you so much. You can keep going then.
Okay, do you want me to go back? I mean, we have less than 15 minutes left. What's your preference?
I leave that up to you. You can make that decision.
Just go back one slide. Okay, so we just go back one slide, and I won't spend a lot of time with it because folks will get the slides. But we were talking about communities, then we got into profiling the communities, and then we got into some of the cultural attributes that one needs to consider in terms of communities and in terms of engaging with those who we serve and who do we work with. And some of our broad headings were cultural identity, where we think more of race, age, gender, sexual orientation, family roles. When we think of language and literacy, we spoke of English proficiency, but then I also mentioned in terms of literacy levels and making sure we have a common language. So very often, if we're both speaking English, what does that mean? There may be some colloquialism that we need to pay attention to, and of course, our reading levels. Is the person at a grade 2, grade 3, grade 6 reading level, and make the modifications and adjustments accordingly. We spoke about cultural origins, where is someone born, the migrant, length of stay in the country, and or county, I'm glad it says county, because length of stay in the country is important. Very often what we don't pay attention to is length of stay in the county or the town, because we think of New York State, it's very different. Upstate, very different from downstate. I know some people downstate think of Westchester as upstate. No, upstate is Rochester and Buffalo and very rural. Very, very different nuances. And we really want you to pay attention to the social determinants of health, because what we do know, and literature does support, a lot of research does support this, that only 30% of one's recovery happens in the face-to-face engagement. The other 70% happens outside in the community, and all these things and more does have an impact on the person's recovery. I want you to focus some on educational levels again, because the research is very clear that the lower an individual's educational level, the worse their health outcomes are. We need to pay, and if we know that, then we need to focus on, if this is their educational level, if Lenora is at a grade 3, what do we need to do with Lenora to ensure that she gets the services that she needs, that meets those levels? We then started talking about engagement, building relationships, and collaboration. It is building, the relationship building is huge. For us to engage with individuals or colleagues or the clients that we serve, we must have a trusting relationship with them. People are much more open when they feel, we have built trust and they are comfortable with us. If you think of your own relationships with individuals and you begin to put a marker of 1 to 10, and I'm sure we have lots of things that will say, we have a great relationship because of this, because of that. Let's think about that for a minute and transfer that thinking to when we have to deal or engage with clients or colleagues. What is it that we need so that those who we work with and those who we serve, we can engage them in the relationships that will allow for great outcomes. And to do that, we really need to understand the individuals as cultural beings. Cultural broker, quick on cultural broker, is someone who is trusted by those who we're serving and who the system trusts. So someone who can really bridge the gaps between us as those service recipients and where the individual is going to go get services. And that's huge, because very often we do not have the cultural beings in our organizations that can engage with those we're serving. And this is a nice way of bringing someone to help us bridge a gap. And when you get your slides, it will go into a little bit more, because they don't have to be of the same culture as the person you're serving. The big piece of it is they need to understand the cultural nuances and they need to be a trusted person. Nancy will now take a few minutes and go over cross-cultural communication.
So as Wilnar just mentioned, when you serve as a broker for a cultural group, you don't necessarily have to come from that group itself. You just have to be a trusted individual. And so we're going to embark upon a conversation regarding cross-cultural communication. So that's when you may not represent through race, ethnicity, or cultural identity with the person that you're serving, but you're having to communicate with them. So what are some things that you want to consider to promote productive cross-cultural communication? First is that you want to understand that individuals are vulnerable. They're coming into your space. They're sharing some maybe necessarily unsavory things about their life experience, and you're unknown to them. You have to take in consideration that through that vulnerability, it may have been birthed upon historical distrust of systems. So how do you bridge that gap? You want to be open to learning more about that individual. You are not the expert in their culture. You are only an expert listener. The expert in that conversation regarding that person is that person. You want to make sure that you communicate with respect, empathy, and appreciation, recognizing that you may make some cultural blunders. And if you do, you want to enter into that space with humility and express your apology for making the mistake, but also express your willingness to learn to be better, to do better in your cross-cultural communication. You want to be aware of the characteristics that are important to that individual. Again, managing your implicit bias in your worldview so that you're not imposing your beliefs and your values into that space, because that is their space and you're there to work collaboratively with them. What should you know? What matters when you're receiving care, recovery, and living in a valued life in the community? Me as a service recipient, I want you to know what my worldviews are, what I value, my attitudes towards the service experience. What are the strengths that I possess? What are some of the barriers that exist in my community? Again, going back to considering those social determinants and recognizing I get well, I get healthy in my own respective neighborhood. But what are some barriers that could serve as an impediment to my wellness and my recovery? And what are some supports that are available in my community as well? Lenore mentioned earlier the Mookie. Mookie may be somebody that you wouldn't necessarily include in the conversation, but Mookie is a broker, and Mookie is very aware of what is available, the resources and assets in that community, and can serve as someone who could help with facilitating that person's wellness. What is the importance of cultural information? It improves that therapeutic service encounter. It helps to build trust because you're entering into a relationship with someone and that person feels that they are truly seen by you and that you accept their truth. It will also enhance the likelihood of greater engagement and appropriate retention and care. Example I give is like if you're dating a person and they don't take the time to get to know you, what's the likelihood that you're going to go on a second date? It allows treatment and care choices to be made that are more appropriate. It's like buying a suit off of the rack or having it tailor-made for you. The feeling that you feel and that know that it has been made specifically for you, the quality of that, your appearance is improved because it's yours, made by you and your measurements. Allows care service plans to be developed that are better attuned to your cultural identity needs. Again, you're creating a plan that will resonate with me and will fit into my life and my lifestyle. We have a couple polling questions. We kind of want to gauge from you all what it is that you're doing in your own respective organizations in regards to the cultural information that you collect or be aware of among your service population. So regarding the cultural groups in your service area, we want to know if you're collecting these items and the relevance of collecting them. For example, we're trying to build a cultural knowledge about the service population. We want to be able to tailor our services to meet their needs. And some of these you may say that, well, I conduct this type of work and we don't need to be concerned about death rates. Well, for example, we talk about violence in the community. We understand that, for example, among young African-American men, the death rates are highest. The cause of death is through violence. So if you don't know that and you have a young African-American male coming into your business for service and you're trying to provide service for them and you don't incorporate that knowledge into the service delivery and you're saying that you need to catch the bus at 2 o'clock in the morning and that's the highest time that violence occurs and you're not aware of that, you could be putting that person at risk, and then they don't show up at your office and you're wondering why.
And Nancy, I just want to add something. We heard some data recently, yesterday, as a matter of fact, that a presenter shared some data that they collected based on the recent police brutality when it comes to African American men. And they say that for every time there's someone who was unharmed and was shot and died, the mental health response from African American men negatively shot up. So their episodes of mental illness increased, and they did not have to live in the area where that person was killed. And that's interesting. So for us, if you think of somebody living in that same area, what impact that would have on somebody's well-being, although they may not know the person, but just knowing that this is what happened to someone who they can identify with, as a caregiver, these are things that you need to be taken into consideration.
So if we have the polling question up, if you could rank based on your understanding of your organization regarding these different cultural groups, do you collect this information? Unemployment rates, your death rates, crime rates, poverty levels, and homelessness within your service region and among your service population. So we're going to collect that and move on to the next polling question so that you can ponder that as well, because we want to honor your time. So we're going to just collect this whole in your information. It seems like we've lost visual.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we're back.
Yeah. So we're still doing the polling. Looks like we're experiencing technical difficulties today. So I think Murphy is visiting us, and so we apologize for that. Technology is a great resource to use when it's working correctly. So up to the next
I think we should just keep it moving because we're not going to be able to fix the technology issues with the polls right now.
We agree. So we could just go to the next slide.
Yes. So if I can regain control of the slides again, please. Let me see here.
You can just talk to it.
Okay, so the next poll was questions that you just want to consider on your own is how well are you able to describe the social problems of the cultural group in your service area, as well as how well are you able to describe the cultural strengths of the community, and have you incorporated this information in the conversations with your client? So again, we've talked about that at length throughout this whole conversation, is that it's important to know who it is that you're serving, collecting that information, but more importantly, how do you incorporate it into how you provide the service delivery and how you use that data to inform improvements within your organization. And you have an opportunity to do the poll as well. All right, and so if we go to the next slide, in summary, Lenora. So in summary, what we talked about today, the professional keys to engagement when serving individuals is that you need to first and foremost understand who you are as a cultural being and how that impacts service delivery and the interpersonal interactions, those cross-communication experiences that you'll have with the people you serve and those that you work with. You want to ask questions with humility. Be very conscientious of the fact that you don't know what you don't know and that mistakes will be made, but be ready with an apology when necessary and always ready with a display of respect. Take the necessary time for relationship building and the establishment of trust. So when you begin to think about how you roll out your service delivery, include in that meeting time with those people that you serve that you want to ask how they're doing, what's going on with their life. You want to gain trust through that relationship building. So include that as a crucial part of your service delivery. Engender the presence of welcoming attitudes and behaviors. Don't just say that you're there. Be present, be engaged, be welcoming, and make sure that you are exhibiting a vulnerability on your part as well. Utilize effective cross-communication, respect the truth and the perspective of others. Often I'll say, don't yuck my yum. So if it's yummy to me and it's yucky to you, don't yuck it. Believe that individuals have a right to self-determination and are capable of being self-reliant. We can do it. We know how to do it. We are the expert on ourselves. Document and include in the service delivery the individual's assets, strengths, and cultural identity. So you collect the information and you use the information to inform how you conduct your business with the individuals you serve.
So one thing that we didn't put there, Nancy, is regarding the implicit bias, that we all have biases and we have to manage it. We will never get rid of it, but as long as we're aware, we acknowledge it, then we're better able to manage those biases. So it doesn't become the barrier in our therapeutic process.
And we have the next slide, which is one of Lenore's favorite slides. And it says, I am who I am, and that's all I can be. I am who I am. Accept me, reject me, but I am still me. And that's very important to notice and remember in the forefront of your mind. We have some references on the next slide so that you can do a deeper dive on your own, because cultural competence is a journey and not a destination, and we have to be lifelong learners. So if you want to review some more of this information and connect the dots better for yourself, here are some references.
Did anything come with the chat box? Any questions?
No. We have no questions that came in, and it's 11:01, so we're going to ask everyone to please, if you have questions, feel free to email me directly, or you can put it in the question box right now, and Lenora and Nancy will get together with them and have them respond to your questions. So please do that. I know we've had some technical difficulties today with audio and then again with polling. So we really do apologize for this. And the presentation was amazing. Lenora and Nancy, don't be disheartened. It was just such amazing content, and we really appreciate your doing this for us. The information is just so important to our work. And so if we could please advance the slides to the last one, I just want to talk about the next step. And yes, thank you to the team. And so our next webinar is Thursday, August 16th at 10 a.m. And it's Outcomes Aren't Just for the Boss Anymore: How to Incorporate Outcomes into My Work. So please join us for that. And this has been recorded and will be posted. And again, please feel free to email me, ruthcw@niapers.org, with questions, and we will get them answered. Thank you so much for joining us today. Take care and have a wonderful day.